Hello and welcome to today's TES web chat. My name's Sarah Canane, I'm Editorial Content Manager at TES Resources. Now, in the issue of the 5th of October TES, we ran an article outlining some of the shocking effects that access to hardcore pornography was having on today's students. I'm joined here in the studio today by the author of that article, Chloe Comby, as well as Alice Hoyle. Hello both.
Hello.
Chloe teaches English at a London comprehensive and is also the founder of creative art after-school group Right Club. Alice is a freelance sex and relationships education teacher, and she's also an elected member of the Advisory Council of the PSHE Association. So Chloe, if I could turn to you first, because you actually wrote the article for the TES.
I did.
Can I ask what led to you wanting to write an article such as that?
Well, teenagers are kind of the least discreet people you'll ever meet. So anything they're talking about or interested in, you immediately know. And you don't have to be kind of a genius or be particularly perceptive to work out that, you know, the internet is awash with pornographic images and pornographic films. And teenagers kind of talk about things and you kind of hear things, the rumblings of things, or, you know, the underground of things. But what I was finding was that these kind of comments were becoming more overt and translating into questions. So teenagers were actually kind of starting to, I think, kind of seek out, if not answers, kind of advice, and saying, you know, in a kind of ha-ha way, I saw this, miss, or my friend saw this, or this was on my phone. But it was clearly, the subtext was, it was a question, I think, kind of shrouded in perhaps a sort of a worry. So of course then you start a dialogue with the teenagers, and you kind of, not necessarily sort of say to them, what have you been watching, or anything as inappropriate as that, but you allow them to talk, and, you know, things come out, and then you sort of learn more, and, you know, and the things I was learning were making me do my own investigation, which obviously wasn't particularly much fun, and really, really quite shocking. And I realised that this was a problem of great magnitude, and I think something that needed to be highlighted. And clearly my experiences were the tip of the iceberg, because I deal with, you know, a small number of students, and, you know, there's millions of teenagers in England and many more worldwide. So I thought, you know, this is obviously a big issue, one that I think is taboo and is not really being talked about. So that kind of prompted me to write the article.
Mm. And why do you think it's not talked about?
Well, I think, you know, there's always been a degree of taboo about sex, and I think particularly where teenagers are concerned, they're not necessarily comfortable talking with adults because they're worried, you know, obviously, that, you know, the adults won't understand. But the other thing that I think teenagers, you know, really find taboo is ignorance. They don't want to admit to not understanding something, or they don't want to admit to finding something overwhelming, or finding something shocking, or finding something worrying, so they don't talk about it. And I think, you know, the pornographic stuff that's on the internet has become so extreme that it's actually driving the sort of the dialogue that teenagers might have with adults, with parents, with teachers and so on, further underground, because there's a sense of, I don't want to seem like I'm ignorant, I don't want to talk about what I'm watching, so there's this kind of, you know, this degree of secrecy that's surrounding the issue. And that's really what I was sort of seeking, not really to expose, because that makes it sound kind of, you know, something nasty, but to discuss in the article.
Mm. And Alice, you yourself wrote an article for the TES, and you spoke about sexualization. You said concern about the sexualization of society and its negative effects on children and young people. The concern was growing, but you felt that the concern may not necessarily reflect the reality. Could you sort of expand on that and say a bit about what you meant when you said that?
Well, currently evidence out there is very mixed as to the harms of pornography on young people, partly because of ethical issues with, you know, looking at pornography and young people, and so you're not getting, you know, when you're doing interviews and things, you know, you can't show young people pornography and then assess the effects, because, you know, huge ethical issues with that. And there's sort of almost two different camps, really. Sort of all porn is harmful, or we don't really know enough about how harmful it is. And I think that one thing that we're denying when looking at sort of the problem of porn is that we're not respecting that young people have their own agency, that, you know, they may be choosing to seek out this material, and they're not being critical about what they're seeking out. But they need support with that, really. But in terms of the research, it's very mixed, because partly we haven't even got a consensus on what pornography is, what sexualization is, and, you know, it's a very difficult area to get that evidence, really robust evidence around the harms of pornography.
And that thing about the definition of sexualization, that was something I actually wanted to ask you about, because do you think it is possible to get a concrete definition, or do you think it very much depends on sort of individuals' sort of sense of morality, if you will?
I think we need to all be working together towards some kind of a definition, because at the minute it seems to take in everything from padded bras to, you know, anything and everything. And what we need to sort of agree is appropriate sort of sexual behaviour, because, you know, young people will exhibit sexual behaviour, and it's that kind of appropriate versus inappropriate. And actually, Brooke have just produced a sexual behaviour traffic light tool, and it's all the age groups from primary 5 years old up to sort of 18-year-olds, with green, amber and red, and that really nicely highlights what, you know, you might expect as normal sexual behaviour and what is more inappropriate, and sort of using tools like that to try and come to this dialogue around what sexualization is and what this inappropriate sexual behaviour is compared to what is normal sexual development.
And in terms of the sex and relationship education that is provided in schools at the moment, just going back to you, Chloe, do you feel that what is sort of sent through and what is available out there, do you feel it meets the needs of the young people and the young people you teach particularly?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think every school is different, so it's impossible to generalise. I think probably there'll be some schools that provide very high quality sex education, and some that provide less so. But I do think, you know, I think this, you know, some of the feedback I've had that's been raised, there does need to be awareness of how technology has kind of fueled, I guess, the sexualisation of teenagers, and there must, you know, sort of education must be aware of that and keep up with it. That, you know, there's not this, you know, what there was 20 years ago of dealing with the odd dirty magazine or you know, a sexy book in the library. This is stuff that's available at children's fingertips or on their phones or on their personal computers 24 hours a day. So there has to be resources in place to kind of not only address that but understand and deal with it. And I think schools have to be kind of realistic about that, and they can't deny it. I think it has to be something that's not only embraced but actually kind of implemented in a kind of an open-minded and educational way.
And Alice, what role do you feel that the government should have in sex and relationships education? I know you mentioned in your article that the current guidance is over a decade out of date. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, currently we're waiting on the findings from the PSHE review, and that was separated off from the main curriculum review. So until the main curriculum review is published, we're not going to find out what the findings from the PSHE review were. And bearing in mind we've had quite a few sort of reviews of PSHE and of sex and relationship education, but with the change in government, things have changed. I think that teachers need leadership and guidance on what we can do and what's appropriate and what needs to happen. And one thing I will say is that unless your sex and relationship education is robust and is strong on the very basics, if you cannot cover contraception, STIs, consent, relationships, trust, honesty, all of those things, you do not cover pornography. You do not go for that controversial next level of that difficult issues unless you are really strong on the basics. Some schools are fantastic and have all of that in place, and, you know, can do that. And if you're not getting the basics right, do not cover this, because you've got to get the basic sex education right first. Absolutely.
And you say getting the basics right there. What would your advice be? I mean, there may be some teachers out there watching who find it very uncomfortable teaching sex education. Do you have any tips or advice for how to make it a bit easier? I don't know which one of you wants to address that first.
I'm going to leave that mostly to Alice, but I'd say specialism. I don't think it's fair at all to place that on teachers who are uncomfortable with that, and I think it makes students uncomfortable. You need to have an environment where there's mutual comfort, and therefore I do think you need either experts in the field or people who are trained in the field and very comfortable in delivering those kind of lessons.
Yeah, no, absolutely, that's exactly right. And making sure you've got your ground rules in place so that you've got a safe environment for the kids to sort of talk about certain issues, and that you're trained in child protection. You've got all the right things underpinning what's going on, and it does require training, and it does require a desire to cover this sort of subjects. Untrained teachers who do not want to teach this subject absolutely should not teach this.
What worries do you find come up when you sort of go into schools from teachers who may have to sort of teach this?
It's more how to address this appropriately, and you absolutely can address this appropriately. Sex and relationship education should always start from where the student is at and what they need to know. So you should really be doing needs analysis with your students. What kind of questions are coming up. If questions aren't coming up around porn, and they may not, you may want to explore other areas. There should be a baseline level of knowledge that kids should have around keeping safe and where to go for help and things like that all kids should have a right to. And then, but if questions are coming up around porn, then you need to develop your programme to meet your students' needs, really. I think that's very important.
And you say programme, so that would be sort of within the context of a lesson. How would you advise teachers to deal with questions that are not coming up in the classroom? You've said sort of students come up to you and sort of almost say stuff jokingly, but have a question behind that. Do you find that easy to deal with?
Well, again, I mean, you're in a it does create a slightly awkward situation, because you obviously have, child protection issues, and you can't get engaged in discussions with students about inappropriate things. But I think if there is a kind of a policy and there are experts within the school, I think there'd be much better guidelines in place to deal with such questions. And it's the worst thing in the world, I think, if a child comes to you raising an important issue, whether it's kind of in jest or it's in seriousness, to sort of say, oh, I don't know, or go away, or no, I'm too embarrassed to answer that. Because I think, whatever kind of way it comes, I think clearly that child has a need to discuss it. And there definitely does need to be kind of parameters in place to support teachers to be able to address that, or correctly pass it on to someone who can deal with it.
Okay. And we've had some questions in from teachers. We've had a question in from Little Brain. Don't do yourself down, Little Brain. He said, or she has said that both of you mentioned sexting, and they're just wondering if you could explain exactly what you mean by that term and why it's such a problem amongst young people.
I think it's still a bit hazy, because I think it kind of encompasses quite a lot of things, but it's basically a text that involves sexually explicit content. So it might be a nude picture, it might be a semi-nude picture, it might be a picture of breasts or genitalia, it might be kind of a picture of a girl's reflection perhaps in the mirror in her underwear, or it might be a text message with sexually explicit content saying that, for example, what she's going to do with a boyfriend, what she'd like to do with a boyfriend, or indeed a girlfriend. So, and they're kind of text messages. They're particularly popular on the kind of sharing things. So, for example, BBM, which is BlackBerry messaging, and they kind of get passed from student to student. But in a nutshell, there are texts with sexually explicit content, whether it's visual or written. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Absolutely. And one thing you need to highlight with your young people is that it can be classed as, if you are under the age of 18, it can be classed as transmitting child pornography. And even saving that picture and sort of sharing it, you could get done with distributing child pornography. So you have to be very, very clear with the young people. And it depends on, there have been, in the States, there have been prosecutions for, on these child pornography things. In the UK, it hasn't happened in that way. However, young people, obviously once they've texted that image and they no longer have control over that image or where it goes, and then it ends up, all across the school or whatever. What what has happened is there have been people charged under, I think it was malicious communications and other areas around harassment and that kind of thing. So there are, you can still find yourself foul of the law. So really clarifying that, and also clarifying with young people that everyone is Googleable now. And, you know, if they choose to share their images on Facebook or whatever, you know, future employers, whoever, could be Googling them and going, oh, well, hang on a minute, they're in that position.
And once something's in the public forum, albeit, you know, Facebook or whatever, that's owned by the internet, that is in a public forum, you have absolutely no control over that image or content at all. That is not yours. It does not belong to you anymore. It is in the public forum, and it's like a plague. I've seen explicit messages and sex messages and films spread from one part of England to another. There were some kids recently, a friend's colleagues, another friend of mine who works at another school, and they had a kind of a video of sexual nature on their phones from a school in Scotland, and it had a thing on it saying what time it'd been filmed, and it was 40 minutes before. So that's how quickly it spreads, and that's something that I really think needs to be instilled into kids. That, you know, you have this thoughtless moment of, oh, that'd be fun. I'll text something.
The high-tech TES studio, everybody.
You know, that'd be fun. I'll text something to my boyfriend, and he passes on something, and the rest is a very, very unfortunate history.
And is it that teenagers aren't aware of the public nature of the internet? Is it that it's almost an invincibility thing, oh, it couldn't happen to me?
Absolutely. I think it's a combination of those two. I think it's that kind of sense of, like, that will never happen to me, a tiny bit of ignorance, and, you know, it's something that's externalised. It's like something that happens to someone else, and, you know, I'm sure I'm not alone in having dealt with students who are beside themselves with grief that something is out in the public forum, and, you know, and once it's out there, there are luckily increasing measures to contain that and laws being put in place, but it's extremely difficult. The internet is a global network.
But I think also with sharing things, I mean, not necessarily the sexting directly, but sharing images and sharing certain material, sometimes young people aren't sharing it, I mean, they may be sharing it for bullying purposes, and they may be sharing it for sexual gratification purposes, but another thing that we're not acknowledging is that they may be sharing it for the yuck factor. You know, oh my God, did they really do that? That's disgusting. And so we're having this huge panic around what they're seeing, and actually the young people themselves are very critical and kind of going, that's not normal, and they know it's not normal. So I think we also need to recognise and appreciate that they're not passive consumers of what they're seeing and sort of going, that's what normal sex is. They know what's in some ways, but they need help developing their critical literacy around that and sort of unpicking it a little bit more. But for the, you know, the two girls, one cup type videos that, you know, often
don't Google that, by the way.
Do not,
especially if you're in the workplace.
Absolutely not. You'll regret it.
Yeah, that it is shared for the yuck factor. It is not shared because people think, oh yeah, that's a normal sexual practice. So,
and I've got a question from Jonesy, who wanted to know if you two had any advice for policies or strategies for dealing with discovering sex acts on the school premises.
Thorny one.
Well, I mean, we said, you know, you may not want a written school policy on this. Depends on parents, but it is a child protection issue, and you know, as teachers, you should be referring it on to child. It will depend on the individual case, because you can't say, you know. So it needs to be dealt with very sensitively and carefully. You know, parents may need to be informed, social services may need to be informed, the police. So it depends on the individual things. But schools do need strategies for dealing with that and need to be aware and recognise how they're going to deal with it. But it will be on an individual case by case exactly what's happened in that case.
And do you think that schools at the moment, the policies they've got in place are unfairly skewed? Because I'm just going off anecdotal evidence here, but I've seen several anecdotes where a sex act has been discovered, and one gender, it's usually the girl, has been punished. Absolutely. And the male hasn't.
Right.
I think it's, again, you have to be a bit careful because it's anecdotal, but I think the key thing there is not all the time, but ordinarily the shame factors placed on the female. You know, and you know, typical of porn, she's kind of in the submissive role. So certainly, if not the punishment is met out to the female, the judgment will be. Whereas there's always that kind of underlying thing of, oh, just a lad. And again, that's being slightly stereotypical. So it's very difficult to say sort of case by case. If there's inequality in how it's dealt with, the shame factor will unfairly be placed on the female with almost no exception at all. And that's something that female will have to live with and deal with, and the social fallout as well, for an awfully long time, which is extremely unfortunate and something that needs to be thought about as well.
And that's also something that needs to be addressed in sex and relationship education, is this sort of gender norms and gender inequality around, the idea that men, if they're very sexually active, are studs, and, whatever, the kids wouldn't use that term. Whereas, if a woman is very sexually active, she's a slut, and that kind of, so unpicking all of these kind of things, and looking at sexual bullying, and there's so much that we need to be working on to address with young people, a lot of things.
And just going back on that, you were talking about the perception of porn and people in porn. In your article, you spoke about the actor James Dean, which is D-E-E-N, moving from hardcore pornographic films to actually something a bit more mainstream. And obviously this is occurring at the same time as the success of the 50 Shades series. It's happening at the same time as a real rather than simulated sex scene is about to take place in a mainstream film. Do you think that we as a culture are becoming more desensitised to more extreme forms of sex, and how is that translating to young people, if so?
Well, I think, yeah, certainly I think there is a desensitisation of in a way, because we're used to sort of seeing much more explicit images and explicit content. But I think it's wrong to assume that we're becoming emotionally desensitised or emotionally detached, because I think the effect of, and I'm not saying everybody's scarred by porn at all, but I think kind of the effect of persistent violent images, hardcore images, books that contain sorts of, a great deal of sadomasochism, they're going to have the same impact that they've always had. And we do have to separate kind of emotionally mature adults from not immature teenagers, but from not fully developed teenagers. And what you're able to kind of take on board as an adult and understand that it's fiction or a fantasy or a reality, it's quite, particularly if you've had relationships, if you've had sexual relationships, it's very different to a teenager. And so, and I touched it upon in the article, but, if you've seen one or several nude bodies in a sort of healthy sexual relationships, you have an understanding of what bodies look like, but teenagers simply don't. They're not going to have seen that many nude bodies. So if their introduction into kind of sex and sexuality are these unrealistic images or these unrealistic kind of simulations of sex or violent simulations of sex, I genuinely think it's going to do them a real disservice, or even quite badly warp them. And I think, obviously, when they do hopefully enter, if they can, sexually healthy relationships, they'll see how false or how kind of fantastical it is.
And
well, I just wanted to add there as well, and that again reinforces the point that we need to be addressing with young people these sort of key themes around sex and relationship education, around supporting young people around what trust means, around boundary setting, around consent. What is enthusiastic consent? What does consent look like? Because in porn, the sort of development of the agreement of consent is all done off camera. They may have very robust consent, but it's not shown. It's sort of, they just jump in there. I don't know. But, so we need to support young people with that communication and all of. So there's lots to unpick that even if schools are not confident with addressing pornography directly, they should be definitely looking at consent, of positive relationships, healthy, this sort of thing, that even if they're not addressing porn, they're addressing things that may be coming up for young people because of porn. But, these need to be addressed with young people. It's really important.
Great.
And we've had a question in from somebody. We've been talking about sort of teenagers secondary level, but obviously we've got to recognise that sort of all pupils of all ages now are probably going to be accessing the internet, and some of them may come across adult content at a younger age. And somebody's asked what the best way is to approach adult content online with primary age children without drawing too much attention to it.
Okay. Well, I would say it's important for primary school teachers to be working with their parents and supporting parents really to have those conversations with the kids, and supporting parents with their own internet sort of literacy around sort of blocking porn at source and trying to keep their primary school age children safe from exposure to that, and kind of keeping, if questions come up from primary school children, keeping them age appropriate, so keeping it at the level they're at. And actually, a top tip with primary school age children is they may ask a question that you suddenly think, oh, I've got to launch into this huge explanation around, and actually they may not have that level of understanding. There's a nice video clip around, Mummy, what's a virgin? And so it's a comedy clip, and Mum launches into this huge explanation, and she's actually asking about olive oil. So it's worth, whenever a child asks a question, well, what do you think it means? Where's that coming? And kind of finding out where they're at, and that will really help you answer the question appropriately.
And also, I think the inappropriate questions are a good sign that your child is accessing inappropriate content, or indeed, your student or your child. So, that's a big clue as to clearly they are accessing it, how they're accessing. So perhaps that's the beginning discussion, perhaps sort of saying to them, why did you ask that? Because clearly a 6-year-old shouldn't be asking about, pornographic content.
And campaigners, such as Esther Ranson, the Daily Mail, they've been calling for just an automatic block on online porn. Do you think this would be an effective way to arrest the rise in children viewing the sort of hardcore pornography that you spoke about in your article, Chloe?
It's a very difficult area. I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's possible to completely block pornography, and I think it's a contentious issue because then you're kind of delving into the whole censorship. I think that it's very unrealistic to suggest let's block porn, because there's some very sophisticated methods in the internet that you can override things. But I do think that there needs to be a very rigorous examination into how easy it is to access pornography, and perhaps reevaluate that. But to say to block it completely, I think, is extremely unrealistic and probably not really useful to debate. I think much better is control.
Yeah, and I think Jackie Thompson's got in touch on Twitter. Hello, Jackie. And she makes a similar point. She says, surely it's impossible to police pupils downloading pornography at school, particularly with the emergence of smartphones.
And that's the point I made in the article, that, if you've read the article, that you can't police this, you can't stop it, particularly with the advocacy of smartphones. So the thing to do is to have a very good discussion about how teenagers can manage this in a way that they can deal with the kind of their association with porn in a constructive way that's not harmful, and hopefully develop kind of a system where they can actually say to themselves, I don't want to see this, I think this is going to be damaging, I think it's wrong to watch this, which would be the ideal, really.
Well, I think also that we have to recognise that young people may be using pornography for their sex education because of their gaps in their sex education. And one concern around the porn block is that websites that are really robust and fantastic for sex education may then get blocked through the porn block because it has the key words, and the porn industry is huge. They will find loopholes to get round things. So, I think the crucial thing is to support the young people with what they're accessing and helping them to be critical of what they're accessing, and, mindful of some of the problems that could occur.
There's an argument that I've certainly heard that by sort of including pornography education in PSHE, it may encourage students to perhaps access material that they may not have been aware of previously. I mean, as a sex education specialist, how would you respond to that, Alex?
Well, I would say that your sex education has to be done on the needs of your pupils. So again, it's about doing this needs analysis and working out what questions coming in, what do young people need to know, what are they asking about. And you will find a lot of young people are asking about porn. That then says, well, actually we need to do something to address this. Miss, we're worried about this.
You can't sweep it under the carpet.
No, we've got to talk about it.
Esme Kethel, I think, on Twitter has got in touch, You've spoken, Alice, about laying ground rules down, and she wants to know what ground rules you'd recommend. She says she doesn't want to overly prescribe, but she doesn't want to silence her students either.
I would always say keeping it a safe space. So in terms of what we talk about in the room stays in the room unless it's a child protection issue, in which case obviously you would then refer it on. But what you don't want is your year 9 pupils going off and then shrieking in the playground what they've done, and the year 7s are all going, oh, I don't know. So so keeping it like that. I always say you can ask me any question that you want. However, I can tell if you're asking a silly question with the aim of embarrassing me or anyone else. And, I may not answer that question. I also have an anonymous question box so that young people who are not comfortable with answering those questions can ask them anonymously. I think it's also important to agree the terminology and, agree that we're going to use the correct terms for... couldn't think of the word then. Correct terms, and if they're not sure, to ask rather than sort of shout out. And I think just the agreement that we all will take it seriously. We're not going to make fun of anyone in the class for asking questions or doing it. And the children respond really well. And if you've got your safe learning environment set up, the young people respond really well, and it feels a lot safer for the teacher to deliver that education material that's so vital. So.
And we've had a comment in from Chocolate Czar. I don't know if that's their real name, a title. I suspect it's neither. But what they've got to say is nevertheless important. They say, I'm not becoming desensitised to sexual imagery. I'm becoming more aware, especially the effect on girls at school. Now, we talked about the effect of girls at school, and you say about the sort of responding to the needs of pupils' sex education. Is there a particular age at which you think sex education should start, and is there as well an age that is most appropriate to introduce education about pornography?
Pornography is a difficult one. I mean, I think if you have a kind of, I think from a young age you need to have kind of perhaps body awareness and sort of family and trust, and I think that kind of evolves. I think they're most from upper primary school to through secondary school, I'd say, is a safe age to have, obviously kind of age-appropriate sex education. So
in a way, I would actually argue younger, but what we need to remember is we're not talking sex education as in sexual activity for young. Sex education includes body parts, it includes puberty. I've got 2 children. My eldest can name the parts of her body. It's just parts of the body. That's fine. And she's not at primary school yet, but it's age appropriate, and that is the crucial thing. Keeping it age appropriate, keeping it at their level, is very, very important.
Absolutely.
Rebecca Avery, hello Rebecca, has got in touch again on Twitter. She says we need an education approach to inappropriate content, not a technical solution. This is a behaviour issue and not a technology one. Given sort of how easy it is to access inappropriate content, do you think it's possible to separate out the behaviour and technology issues?
I do, because I think with good education, I think it hopefully will reach a point where we can, as I think I previously said, there's a degree of self-censorship, perhaps peer censorship. So there is an awareness, when there is this kind of group passing things, or this group kind of discussing of explicit or inappropriate content, to actually sort of address it and be educated enough to say, discussing, particularly the kind of hardcore stuff is actually really unhealthy and quite unpleasant. And again, that is completely about education. It's not about saying that you can't access it. It's giving reasons why you shouldn't want to.
And I think also schools have to adopt a whole school approach. So they have to, in terms of things that can be a knock-on effect from sort of the issue of pornography, is things like sexual bullying and sexual harassment. And, schools have to deal with that as a whole school issue. Everybody, pinging a girl's bra strap or flicking up a skirt, that has to be dealt with very seriously. You can't just go, ha-ha, just messing around. You have to be a blanket, zero tolerance on sort of, these issues in the school. And it has to be a whole school conversation, an issue.
And Alice, you've mentioned the need in your article for the TES the need for sex education practitioners to develop sessions exploring sexual ethics.
Yeah.
Can you just explain what you mean by sexual ethics and why you feel it's important to teach it?
Well, I think, again, it's the sort of things I've been sort of saying earlier around there are these key themes that we keep coming back to around consent, it's boundaries, it's negotiation, and it's working out exactly what we need to be teaching young people and how we can support young people to develop healthy, positive relationships. And, you know, if with a focus on that, it doesn't necessarily have to be the focus on porn. So.
And I think it's probably important to point out, as I think you do in your article, Chloe, that neither of you are in any way advocating stopping teenagers being teenagers,
Absolutely
are you?
not. I think that's a natural thing, and I think, you know, everybody has been a teenager at some time, and I think, you know, that curiosity is part of development, and exploration is part of development. But I think we've reached a point now where there's content that's actually not going to kind of benefit, it's not beneficial. I think it's actually going to distort that. So I think it's kind of addressing that. So it's it's absolutely not. When I'm sort of saying censorship, you know, don't be curious, you know, wait till you're married at all. What we're actually saying is, you know, we want to reach a point where teenagers feel kind of in a healthy, safe space with their own development. Excuse me, and exploration.
And did you have anything to
Well, it's just, developing young people's media literacy, really, so that they know what they're seeing, they can be critical of what they're seeing and recognise how it might affect them.
Okay, well, I think that's a lovely note to end it on. All that's left for me to do is to thank both Chloe and Alice for joining us here in the studio today. If you joined us halfway through or towards the end, don't fear, the rest of this chat will be online, I believe, tomorrow for you to download as a resource. You can also join us again tomorrow at 1 p.m. when we'll be talking to film producer Stephen Woolley about adapting great novels for the screen. So hopefully see you there. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye now.